The tech industry is kind of a mess right now. It's becoming increasingly hard for people to find jobs in tech. And it's particularly hard for any software engineers trying to get into tech right now, like bootcamp grads or recent computer science graduates. All of this made me think of a time in my life when I was struggling to get a software engineering job, where my happiness, my direction in life, and my sense of self-worth were at an all-time low. This is the story of the pain of finding my first software engineering job, my journey through it, and my advice to anyone stuck in the same situation. To get a grasp of the situation, we have to get a small glimpse of what I was like in college. Depending on which version of Kevin you encountered during his college years, you would have found vastly different mindsets. During my first year of college, I was primarily career focused. My main goal was to get a job at Facebook. By the time my fourth year had rolled around though, my priorities had shifted significantly. Laziness and procrastination, those were the themes of my fourth year of college. My attention was all over the place, and I didn't take time to plan my post-college life. Instead, I was distracted by other things, like socializing or making friends, and I actively put off thinking about the future until it was too late. I didn't have any real software internship experience. I didn't know any web frameworks. I didn't know how to interview for software companies. And I hadn't studied a single question of LeetCode code or cracking the coding interview. This lack of foresight, it all came back to haunt me on the day of my graduation. For most people, graduation is a moment of triumph. It's like the culmination of years of hard work and moving on to the next stage of your life. But for me, that day was the saddest moment I had experienced up until that point in my life. Looking back, I realized that I had barely changed since the first day I walked onto campus. My work ethic was still terrible, my social skills were terrible, and I hadn't achieved the goals that I set out to achieve. And worst of all, I was not ready for this next phase in my life. And I knew that I was about to be forced into a deep, dark time before anything got better for me personally or professionally. I moved home from college about 3 months after graduation. And at the time, I had not even begun to understand the weight of the position that I was in. I had no job prospects lined up. And even worse, I hadn't even made an effort to secure one. My resume? Unimpressive, to say the least. But I remember hearing about the intense demand for software engineers at that time and all the years previously. I tricked myself into believing that my computer science degree alone would be enough to land me a job. I mean, I spent 4 years in college, right? Surely that was enough to secure my future. A piece of wisdom that I've learned in the past few years: there are only two ways people change. People either change after deep self-reflection and self-improvement, or they are forced to change by circumstance. And this circumstance was about to hit my life very, very soon. At the time, I looked around at my friends and classmates and saw them getting jobs at top tech companies. And I thought that I could do the same. I wanted to work for a unicorn startup because in my head, that's where I belonged. And it couldn't be that hard to get in, could it? But as I started applying to jobs, I realized just how misguided I really was. I submitted like 10 applications my first week to companies like Snapchat, Pinterest, Yelp, thinking that they were easy targets while I worked my way up to big companies. And then I waited a week. Okay, so I applied to a few more jobs that I thought were in my skill level, like Dropbox, Groupon, Intuit. But again, the results were the same. Nothing. For someone who had been so naive, so deluded, and so used to getting what I wanted, this came as a surprise. My degree was not enough to get me hired. I even remember this one instance, 2 months after moving back home. I managed to secure an interview with a company in Southern California. And the whole time going through the interview process and the recruiter screens, I thought getting the job would be easy. I didn't spend any time preparing for this interview. And instead, I focused on learning how to negotiate my salary. And as you can expect, I didn't get the job. And in fact, I wasn't even close. I remember hanging out and talking with my friends afterwards. We were grabbing a beer. I was talking about my interview, downplaying the situation, talking about how I didn't want to work there anyway. And as I wrapped up my story, my friends just quietly acknowledged it, changed topics, and then we moved on. I couldn't really understand at the time why my friends were so quiet in response to my story. But now I can see how clueless and delusional I was, and just how badly I struggled with self-awareness and humility. I see now how I came off to them. Here was this kid who hadn't paid his dues in life. He didn't have a job. He hadn't worked hard or accomplished anything of note, and he had a right to complain about job prospects. No one was going to tell me how misguided my thinking was. It was up to me to figure it out on my own. In the next few months, my job search became increasingly difficult. I was not aware that most companies tend to slow down their hiring process at the end of October in preparation for the holiday season. This was something that caught me completely off guard, and the true pressure of the situation began to set in. It had been nearly 5 months since I graduated college, and I wasn't even close to getting a job. I found myself submitting dozens of job applications per day while going through online forums, Reddit, or just anything to look for advice on how to get a job. I was told to study LeetCode, to learn web frameworks, to build side projects, to network with other people for referrals. And I just began to get completely overwhelmed by the number of things I needed to do to get a software job. And I realized there were people out there that studied 10 times harder for 10 times longer and still were unable to get a job. And despite me submitting hundreds of applications, I received very few responses. In the month of December, I was able to secure 2 on-site interviews with startup companies in San Francisco. In one of the interviews, the interviewer ended my technical screen early, probably because of my performance, and instead opted into having a friendly conversation with me. He asked me the question, "So, what did you do in school?" I knew what he was asking me. Failing interviews, it was painful, but that was nothing compared to seeing the disappointment in my parents' eyes. I couldn't help but think of the sacrifices they made to immigrate to this country, working hard to attend school here, to find a job here, and to leave everything behind to make a better life for their children. And as I struggled to find a job, as I submitted 600 job applications to almost every company I could find in the state of California, I couldn't help but feel like I was letting them down. And at the same time, letting myself down. People don't change unless they go through a heavy amount of self-reflection or they are forced to by circumstance. Ironically, this whole situation about me not being able to find a job, it was jarringly similar to an experience I had just 4 years previously. Instead of a job search, I was in high school and I was trying to get into top colleges. I had spent most of my high school years procrastinating, neglecting my grades. I had a mediocre at best college application, and yet I thought I had a chance to apply and get into top colleges because that's what my friends were doing. And when the time came to receive college acceptances, I found myself rejected by almost every school I applied to. I remember one of my SAT tutors sat me down and told me to never put myself in a situation where I wasn't preparing for the future ever again. And while some of that message might have stuck with me for a bit, obviously none of it stuck long term. People don't change unless they are forced to change. I would like to tell you after this point how I completely transformed, how I studied like 18 web frameworks until I became the perfect candidate, but none of that happened. Truly what happened came down to numbers and luck. Applying for jobs, it will always be a numbers game. This was no exception. I had spent months trying to create side projects to put on my resume, trying to learn React, trying to read through cracking the coding interview. And finally, in January of 2017, I received a call from a tiny 5-person startup located in San Diego. I was lucky enough to be asked technical questions in fields that I had prepped pretty well in the last few months. And even luckier, this company was looking for a very specific profile of software engineer. Someone who was a new college grad, someone who could code and figure out problems, and someone who was willing to take a low salary. And so this was my lucky break in the end. So far removed from my original delusions of working for Facebook or some startup unicorn. But after the months of failure, nothing was sweeter than this sense of success I had in the moment. Sometimes I think of the scenario of if I didn't get that job offer. I wonder how long I would have been searching before I finally found one. A couple more months? 6 months? A year? A couple years? Would I have just given up? It's difficult to tell, but it was definitely one of the first lessons in my life about how incremental progress every day helps you to reach your goal. If I wasn't studying LeetCode, learning web frameworks, applying to jobs little by little every day, even this random stroke of luck, it wouldn't have panned out. If you found my story relatable in any capacity, you need to be the reason to make a change for yourself in life. At a certain point, no one will push you, no one will say anything to you, no one will force you to do anything. You will have to do it yourself willingly or be forced to by painful circumstance.